This is the principle which a wise man must follow in his relations toward his own city. Let him warn her if he thinks her constitution is corrupt and there is a prospect that his words will be listened to and not put him in danger of his life. But let him not use violence upon his fatherland to bring about a change of constitution. If what he thinks can be best accomplished by exile and slaughter of men only, let him keep his peace and pray for the welfare of himself and his city. The seventh letter, 331d. These words are often attributed to either Plato or Speusippus, depending on one's view of the authenticity of the seventh letter in the Thrasylean collection of Plato's works. But whoever composed them, they constitute an excellent general description of the doctrine of political pacifism. So too is the Athenian visitor's attack on Spartan militarism in Book 1 of Plato's Laws. For a definition of a more general form of pacifism, Jan Narveson's work might be consulted, where in arguing that pacifism is self-contradictory, he states that pacifism is not only the view that violence is evil, but also that it is morally wrong to use force to resist, punish, or prevent violence. Note that the conception of pacifism discussed by Narveson implies not only the idea that violence is extrinsically morally problematic, but also that it is intrinsically wrong. It is to be contrasted to the words of the author of the seventh letter, from my quoted epigraph, which do not condemn violence per se, but only its use to address political problems. For it is one thing to admit that there are various political problems concerning the employment of violence. It's quite another to hold that violence is evil and its use always wrong. The former moderate view implies that violence can lead to various moral difficulties, such as the problem of collateral damage, but it leaves open the possibility that there are circumstances in which violence absent collateral damage might well be morally justified. However, the latter view condemns any use of violence, amounting essentially to an absolute moral prohibition against the use of violence of any kind, including legal punishment. In this paper, I shall explore what a pacifist might argue about punishment, both in terms of the institution of punishment and in terms of particular forms of punishment as hard treatment. In so doing, I find that a genuine pacifist will typically not be able to make room for various punishment-related concepts, such as responsibility in the liability sense, proportionality, desert, and thus falls short of an acceptable moral theory which respects these important moral concepts. In turn, it will run afoul of a kind of utopianism, it seems. I want to note definitions of some key concepts and then argue that pacifism underlies punishment abolitionism and that punishment abolitionism is problematic, at least insofar as pacifism is problematic. In so doing, I shall argue that pacifism either explicitly or implicitly denies other moral concepts that I've mentioned, and insofar as those concepts are problematic, as they are typically articulated in the philosophical literature, then so is pacifism, and by extension, punishment abolitionism. There are various reasons, I shall argue, why the kind of pacifism underlying punishment abolitionism is problematic. Again, one is that it fails to take sufficiently seriously considerations of desert. Another is that it fails in many cases to take sufficiently seriously considerations of retrospective liability responsibility. And yet another is because it fails to account for considerations of proportionality in deserved punishment. In other words, pacifism, the pacifism underlying punishment abolitionism, simply denies the importance of punishment and its underlying concepts. But denying something is not the same as refuting it. By punishment, I mean the Feinbergian notion of hard treatment. But I also mean what John Rawls meant by punishment when he defined it in the following terms. A person is said to suffer punishment whenever he is legally deprived of some of the normal rights of a citizen on the ground that he has violated a rule of law, the violation having been established by trial according to due process of law, provided that the deprivation is carried out by the recognized legal authorities of the state, that the rule of law clearly specifies both the offense and the attached penalty, that the courts construe statutes strictly, and that the statute was on the books prior to the time of the offense. By pacifism, I mean what Narveson means when he describes it not only as the view that violence is evil, but also that it is morally wrong to use force to resist, punish, or even prevent violence. It is the idea that pacifism holds that it is morally wrong to use violence to punish harmful wrongdoers that concerns me most in this paper. In his book, Aggression and Crimes Against Peace, Larry May articulates, in his building a case for what he calls contingent pacifism with regard to war, what a contingent pacifist might say about capital punishment. While a contingent pacifist might concur that in principle capital punishment is justified in some cases, there are too many cases wherein various factors during due process frustrate justice and fairness such that capital punishment should not be meted out. He writes, and I'll quote him extensively here, "When it comes to actual cases," May writes, "the problem is that trial procedures do not guarantee accurate verdicts even in capital trials. Indeed, the chances that an innocent person, or at least the wrong person, will be convicted or that the jury will fail to see significant mitigating factors or overstress aggravating factors are so great as to undermine any warrant for thinking that capital punishment will be used only for guilty persons. Even though one might recognize the moral justifiability of capital punishment for some types of cases in theory, one can become a contingent opponent of capital punishment, or as it might be called, a contingent abolitionist. According to this view, capital punishment should not be employed if it looks as though defendants will be executed when they do not deserve to be. A similar position could be taken on the justifiability of war, resulting in what I have been calling contingent pacifism." He continues, "The contingent abolitionist about capital punishment does not say that all cases of capital punishment are morally unjustified. Indeed, there may be cases, at least in theory, in which the evidence is nearly unassailable that a defendant who is about to be executed is the one who committed an especially egregious murder. What drives the contingent abolitionist to a position similar to the opinion of those who on absolute principled grounds oppose all capital punishment is a belief that in most, if not all cases, there is a significant risk that an innocent defendant will be falsely convicted and then executed. The contingent abolitionist, however, remains open to the possibility that some cases of capital punishment are justified. The contingent abolitionist allows that capital punishment can be legitimate and worries only that innocent persons might be mistakenly convicted of capital crimes." Now, it would follow from May's position, for example, that those most strongly and directly responsible for the morally unjust U.S. military invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan from 2003 to the present, for instance, deserve to be severely punished for their war crimes, so much so that capital punishment would likely be the appropriate punishment for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis, among others. That is, should proportionality in punishment be taken seriously. Contingent pacifism can and should adopt precisely this position on the cases in question if it is to take seriously vital concepts such as responsibility, desert, and proportional punishment. For whomever adequate due process identifies as the most guilty and responsible for the war crimes in question deserves and must be sentenced to death. I've argued for this at length in my article, U.S. Responsibility for War Crimes in Iraq, in a recent issue of Res Publica, but I won't repeat those arguments here. Surprisingly, May's contingent pacifism amounts to retributivism, properly construed. Namely, the view that says, subsequent to adequate due process, those and only those responsible for crimes ought to be punished for them in approximate proportion to the harms caused to others. The locution ought to be entails the idea of desert so that those who satisfy the conditions of moral responsibility, or legal responsibility for that matter, are deserving of punishment in proportion to the harms they illicitly wrought on others. In many cases, this means some form of physically violent punishment directed against those criminals who commit violent actions against innocents, though it is quite an open question as to whether or not a non-physically violent crime is ever deserving of a violent punishment. We'll set that issue aside. If proportional punishment is to be taken seriously, then what else but a rather violent physical punishment would be fitting for, say, political leaders who start unjust wars that eventuate in the killing of many innocents, or for even, for that matter, Wall Street defrauders and those congressional leaders who by gross negligence or otherwise intentionally set up a system that cannot adequately punish such fraud? Yet as we see from Narvison's definition of pacifism, pacifism disallows for violence as a form of punishment. It would follow that pacifism, that kind of pacifism in any case, thus construed cannot make sense of the concepts of liability, responsibility, desert, and proportional punishment, at least in many cases. For while some cases of punishment would not require all relevant things considered, violent punishment of offenders, several other cases would. And it is these other cases that render pacifism implausible because it's counterintuitive concerning the matter of punishment for severe, harmful wrongdoing. While May might think that I'm a closet, and he does, think that I'm a closet contingent pacifist because as a retributivist, I cannot accept under any circumstances being fully morally justified the punishment of innocence, I think he's a closet retributivist for exactly the same reasons. Perhaps he and I are engaged in a merely verbal dispute, and if so, I can think of far worse things in life, as he's a brilliant mind and I've admired his work for many years. But it's important to properly understand retributivism and to not construct a philosophical theory against it that turns out to mimic it in crucial respects. And while one wants to avoid even the mere appearance of bifurcation here, it is unclear whether or not there is a viable conception of pacifism that can serve as a genuine conceptual alternative to retributivism on the one hand and pacifism on the other. While I do not rule this out, I'm unsure or I'm unaware that this is the case. Pacifists do not want to fall into the problem of adopting principles of punishment that end up collapsing pacifism into some form of retributivism, I take it, thereby misleadingly thinking that pacifism can be revised to evade certain objections, such as the ones that I'm posing here, when in fact it cannot be made to do so given what is so crucial to the pacifist position. Yet pacifists also want to avoid, if they can, adopting principles of punishment that essentially support a kind of punishment abolitionism, as punishment abolitionism fails to take seriously, as I've said before, responsibility, desert, and proportionality in punishment, and is hence counterintuitive insofar as it might be grounded in a kind of hard determinism, as I'll say something about that in a moment, that rejects outright the very ideas of responsibility, desert, and proportional punishment. However, even May's rather nuanced position is problematic insofar as it might be applied to the problem of punishment more generally. For while in such cases contingent pacifism about punishment in general would rightly be concerned with the wrongful punishment of innocence, and while it might rightly require that an acceptably high, not perfectly high, degree of conditions of responsibility are satisfied in order for capital punishment to be morally justified, its entailed or seemingly implied punishment abolitionism may well be a morally unwelcome position. For it would in turn seem to implicitly require a kind of moral perfectionism, which is untenable. By this I mean that it would imply that unless a person satisfies the conditions of responsibility in a rather perfectly strong sense, then she is not a genuine candidate for punishment. And if this position is generalized to all moral agents, no one would qualify as a punishable agent, making punishment abolitionism plausible. Yet, even on the supposition that no one ever satisfies strongly the conditions of responsibility that are necessary and jointly sufficient for punishment, it does not follow that no one ever satisfies adequately such conditions, such that he or she might be well qualified as a punishable agent. Thus, it would seem that punishment abolitionism must, among other things, deny that any moral agent satisfies adequately, or even could satisfy adequately, the conditions of responsibility, such that he or she could be rightly punished. But this is a most counterintuitive result. Just as moral agents often deserve praise and are rewarded for their good deeds, so they often commit acts as responsible agents such that they are deserving of blame and punishment. Moral perfectionism concerning responsibility thus seems to lead to an implausible result. It's not that punishment is never morally justified, or that it can never be morally justified because moral agents never do and can never satisfy the conditions of moral responsibility or legal responsibility, for that matter, with regard to this or that action, omission, or attempt. Rather, responsibility admits of degrees, and it is a matter of the extent to which a moral agent satisfies the said conditions and precisely what range of punishments is appropriate or fitting, fair, and just as the state's response to her harmful wrongdoing. The moral perfectionism that seems to implicitly underlie the version of pacifism in question here appears to be contingent on the plausibility of the metaphysical doctrine of hard determinism, according to which there are no uncaused actions, omissions, or attempts, and according to which no one is rightly held accountable for anything they do because they lack the freedom or autonomy or voluntariness necessary to qualify as a responsible agent who owns his acts actions, omissions, or attempts in the Frankfurtian sense. But again, this doctrine too is counterintuitive and highly contested. Hard determinism, not unlike compatibilisms and libertarianisms, seem to be more of an assumption than a theory that is the result of hard-fought philosophical analysis and argument. For this reason, I assume that some version of metaphysical compatibilism is plausible. I have in mind here a compatibilism between free will, voluntariness, and autonomy on the one hand, and forces of economic, political, religious, and so forth causation on the other. But it is also a compatibilism between causation on the one hand and moral responsibility on the other. Thus, I believe that it is less controversial, morally and metaphysically speaking, to adopt a compatibilist standpoint pertaining to such matters as responsibility and punishment. But this in turn poses problems for pacifism, or at least the pacifism in question. Let us explore matters further in order to understand whether or not pacifism as a moral doctrine can withstand philosophical criticism concerning matters of punishment. If moral perfectionism is untenable as a supporting concept of punishment abolitionism, is not capital punishment abolitionism problematic for the same reason? If it is, then May's position about contingent pacifism concerning capital punishment is dubious in that some harmful wrongdoers who illicitly take the lives of others qualify for capital punishment. I have in mind here, for instance, David Westerfield, see California v. Westerfield, as well as a host of other cases, and indeed several harmful wrongdoers who will never face trial for their primary roles in the recent military invasions I mentioned earlier. The objection for moral perfectionism does not, however, count against retributivism, in that retributivism can reasonably accommodate concerns about imperfections in the institution of punishment by implementing a capital punishment review system that I have detailed elsewhere, a set of programs similar to what is commonly known as the Innocence Project, that increases dramatically the amount of expert legal person power devoted to the thorough review of capital cases in order to do all that can be reasonably done to not sentence folk to death who do not deserve it. In effect, I'm advocating a system that amounts to a widespread Innocence Project that is tied to and supported by each and every US-based law school and funded by student tuition costs and made a requirement of law school graduation. It would be bipartisan in the sense that those who do not support capital punishment would be pleased to participate in the program in order to contribute to a team of faculty-supervised law school students who might free innocents on death row. And those who support the institution of capital punishment would want to participate because those and only those who deserve the death penalty, on their view, should be put to death. This widespread Innocence Project serves as a significant check and balance in proper convictions, especially in capital cases, although it could be extended to any such kind of legal case, criminal case. As noted above, pacifism fails to take seriously the fact of human retrospective liability responsibility. It fails in turn to take seriously what moral agents deserve, and in the process it fails to take seriously, or sufficiently seriously, the problem of proportional punishment. In vogue these days is the idea that the very institution of punishment is even in principle morally untenable. It is not, as May argues, that in principle there may be cases where capital punishment is properly administered, where sentencing is justified, all relevant things considered in a criminal case. It is rather that for such authors the very idea of punishment is morally unjustified and must be replaced with some version of rehabilitation, including moral education, of even duly convicted criminals regardless of the severity of their crimes. This is a strong version of punishment abolitionism, not just capital punishment abolitionism, but punishment abolitionism. Besides the fact that for several decades there has been no credible evidence from the US that any kind of program of criminal rehabilitation has had more than a rather modest success rate at best, assuming such reported success rates are genuine and accurate, it is unclear that such a position is grounded in a plausible analysis of legal or moral responsibility. Indeed, a study of such works typically finds them lacking altogether in even recognizing the detailed nuances of moral responsibility theory. So apparently it is unimportant to such theorists that at least some criminals might very well fully or quite adequately satisfy the conditions of responsibility. Yet they argue for the abolition of the institution of punishment as if the only or even best response of the state to even the most horrendous rights violations is some form of rehabilitation, no matter how liable a criminal might be in committing her crimes. This position, I suspect, might well mask a kind of pacifism about punishment as hard treatment. But regardless, it is important for us to understand, at least in part, what punishment abolitionism implies, or what's consistent with it. Various problems arise for pacifism regarding the institution and particular forms of punishment. First, as noted, pacifism fails to account for human retrospective liability responsibility for actions in cases of severe injustices and harms. But consider the example of an evil and powerful military regime that is bent on taking over other countries while engaging in genocide in the process. It would appear that the only way to stop the evil regime is to subdue it with violence. This might involve assassinating the leaders of the movement or the leader of the movement, committing terrorist acts against the military and so forth in self-defense or in defense of others who are innocents. Christian theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer's involvement in the attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler serves as a good example of even a strict pacifist realizing that some violence in self-defense and defense of other innocents is morally the right thing to do. Second, as noted, pacifism fails to take into consideration, the pacifism in question, fails to take into consideration what responsible wrongdoers deserve for severe harms and injustices they cause. Committing violent acts against the evil military regime both holds it accountable, in one sense of the word responsible, for its evils and giving it what it deserves because it is responsible in the liability sense for its evil actions. It also is a gesture of innocence taking responsibility for their own lives and the lives of other innocents in standing up to the evil regime. Rejecting pacifism implicitly upholds these moral values. Third, pacifism fails to account for the notion of proportionality in the punishment of severe wrongdoers. Simply put, being nonviolent toward the evil regime in question is hardly a proportional response to, say, genocide or attempted genocide. I have in mind here Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and their pernicious influence on the seeking of justice for victims of genocide and other, or attempted genocide and other severely violent crimes. What is a roughly proportional response, at least in many such cases, is the execution of the wrongdoers. Pacifists will eschew violence in such forms. However, many pacifists are so committed to the ideals of nonviolence and humanitarianism that they disrespect the principles of proportionality and punishment that would clearly justify harsh kinds of durations of physical and psychological punishment, deserved of, say, the capos or leaders of the drug cartels in Mexico, for instance, who are ultimately responsible for the murders of thousands of innocent civilians, many of whom suffered torturous deaths at the orders of such men and even decapitation. To deny that such capos are evil and that they deserve to be treated in proportion to what they are responsible for visiting on others is to deny genuine justice to them, especially insofar as there are no mitigating circumstances concerning their violent crimes. Yet this is precisely to what pacifism in question is committed to in such instances. What except lengthy and the most painful conditions of punishment can even begin to justly answer drug lords who, for instance, have willingly, intentionally, and voluntarily ordered the kidnapping of infants, Mexican infants, only to then have them surgically opened in the stomach area, cavity area, in order to stuff their body cavities with illegal drugs to smuggle in women's arms across the US-Mexican border in order to gain increasing profits. The same can be said of the thousands of other murders per year that capos are responsible for in Mexico alone, usually against innocent Mexican civilians. Yet the humanitarian principles to which many pacifists are so dedicated cannot begin to take seriously the development of principles of proportional punishment that are required in order to bring justice to such evils. Since the fulfillment of such principles of proportional punishment is morally required in order to respect the lives of the victims of certain evils like this, pacifism ends up disrespecting the lives of victims of such atrocities by refusing to support the proportional principles of such crimes. It also fails or refuses to support the moral rights such victims have to have those who violate their rights punished in proportion to the amount of harm the victims have suffered due to the rights violations in question. By denying the proportional punishment of criminals, punishment abolitionists often instead pacifistically suggest, I think, rehabilitation of such criminals as if a forward-looking utilitarianism were a plausible theory of ethics. It would seem that pacifism, in at least some instances, entails a kind of covert humanitarianism and punishment abolitionism, which often takes the form of utilitarian pleas for rehabilitation due to the fact that various forms of punishment, statistically speaking, fail to deter crimes. So what results is an albeit epistemically locally coherent theory of pacifism about punishment that is often less than open and honest about its hidden presuppositions, ones that I'm seeking to expose here. As just indicated, pacifism of the kind in question also relies on a vague conception of humanity in order to ground its primary assertions about punishment. While it is true that the pacifistic notion of humanity certainly encompasses the ideas of human dignity and intrinsic human value, the great retributivist Kant expresses even capital punishment in terms that he believes are consistent with human dignity and intrinsic value. For instance, Kant argues that inhumane punishments are unjustified as they vilify the state. And of course, he was in favor of capital punishment. So given that even a Kantian retributivist can and does embrace punishment in terms of human dignity and intrinsic human value, as humans are, in his words, beyond all cost, and given that Kantian theories of punishment are committed to the notions of desert, responsibility, and punishment of the guilty and only the guilty, how indeed can the pacifist make sense of responsibility and punishment? And if she cannot, is she not doomed to a repugnant utopianism? Perhaps the most promising manner in which to argue for pacifism about punishment would be the following: to either, 1, question whether or not criminals ever do or even can act sufficiently voluntarily to be held adequately responsible for their crimes, or 2, question whether or not criminals ever do or can even act with sufficient intentionality to be held adequately responsible for their crimes, or 3, question whether or not criminals ever do or even can ever act with sufficient knowledge to be held adequately responsible for their crimes. These lines of thought question not only the idea that liability responsibility can ever accrue to moral agents, but in turn they question whether or not the concepts of desert and proportional punishment, indeed punishment itself, can ever rightly accrue to them. But even if pacifists argue thusly, they are indistinguishable from retributivism, properly construed. For I, as a retributivist, precisely do hold that no one ought to be punished short of their qualifying as a genuinely responsible agent, for only the guilty and responsible should be punished. And this entails that the offender acts with sufficient voluntariness, intentionality, and knowledge as she commits her wrongdoing while being at fault in doing so. Thus, for a pacifist to argue in this way, short of adopting a strongly skeptical stance on such matters, would for her to essentially take a properly retributivist line of thinking. And I take it that pacifists don't desire to align themselves with us retributivists. In the end, however, it just might turn out that the only viable version of pacifism, when it concerns punishment, is one that is compatible with a viable version of retributivism. Now, it might be argued that there's an important difference between pacifism as I construe it here and retributivism properly understood. For while retributivism holds that it is in principle possible to justifiably punish a moral agent to the extent that she commits the wrongdoing as a responsible agent, pacifism holds that even in principle it is wrong to punish offenders because in principle it is impossible that an offender would satisfy the conditions necessary and sufficient for responsibility. However, this pacifistic stance renders pacifism immune from counterexamples and perhaps at too high a cost. for the same position that would seek to rescue itself from the several examples of offenders who deserve capital punishment, say, for their roles in genocides, race-based slavery, and so forth and so on, in that, as the position states, no one is sufficiently responsible for anything she does, is the same position that makes pacifism seemingly unfalsifiable. But in turn, this kind of pacifism cannot then claim that anyone is sufficiently responsible, in another sense, to have a moral duty to, say, provide some sort of humanitarian assistance to others, as many desire to do. This variety of pacifism cannot have it both ways. It cannot claim both that moral agents lack the capacity to act as morally liable agents and simultaneously hold that the very same agents possess the liability responsibility which grounds the moral duty responsibility to assist others. Whether or not pacifism is self-contradictory, it cannot make good sense of intuitively widespread punishment-related concepts such as responsibility, desert, and proportional punishment as hard treatment, including capital punishment. And insofar as the concepts of responsibility, desert, and proportionality are more than merely intuitively plausible, or at least more plausible than their denials, then it behooves one to consider the morality of a view that might turn out to be a pernicious refusal to take responsibility for meting out justice in the world according to the most promising guiding moral principles available. What pacifism needs is not just a denial of or question-begging stance against violent punishment of offenders, but an intuitively appealing and independently supported position that not only renders genuine retributivism untenable, but also one that makes pacifism itself plausible. However, in the end, even assuming that my concerns about pacifism are well-founded, even if we make those assumptions, it behooves me to provide a defense of the key concepts on which my criticism of pacifism rests. After all, significant and fine work has been done by some philosophers on the concepts of desert, responsibility, and proportionality. And while I assume that these concepts, assume for purposes of this paper, that these concepts are part of what makes a plausible moral philosophy, I cannot make that assumption if my argument is to succeed in the end. I must provide arguments to the effect that such concepts are in themselves viable ones. But for purposes of this conference, I've made the assumption that whatever else is required of a plausible moral theory, it must take into account that the typical human being is a moral person in the sense that they sometimes act, fail to act, or attempt to act in ways that deserve to be punished because she's a responsible agent for what she did and should be punished in approximate proportion to her harmful wrongdoing. However, it's intuitively plausible to think that such concepts are at least prima facie plausible. That is, whichever conception of such ideas turns out to be the best and adequate ones. 1. I suppose that my paper implies, among other things, the following challenge to pacifists. Is it plausible, or is it counterintuitive, to think that it is never morally justified for the state to punish persons for their harmful wrongdoings? Recall that the Narvesonian definition of pacifism, with which I'm working here, prohibits punishment. I believe that it is counterintuitive to think that it is never morally justified for the state to punish or inflict harm on harmful wrongdoers, as it abandons without adequate reason the morally intuitive concepts of desert, responsibility, and proportionality. So to the extent that it makes sense to say that a harmful wrongdoer deserves to be held responsible for her harmful wrongdoings, that is the extent to which it is morally justified for the state to punish her in approximate proportion to her harmful wrongdoings. So what's at stake in this paper is a clarification of what the pacifist either implicitly or explicitly denies, but what at the same time most people find quite intuitively plausible. Thank you.
Thank you. Angelo, it's very fine work. Concepts are obviously very demanding. So Saba was the first, Andrew second, and Cheney.
Okay, thank you for the talk. And there's a lot there, so maybe I missed some. some nuance. I'm concerned about your construal of pacifist. You say that pacifists, or at least absolute pacifists, don't think that people deserve punishment, or at least that offenders do not satisfy the conditions of responsibility for the wrongdoings they commit. And I don't see why pacifists are committed to that view. In fact, pacifists can say that people very often do deserve punishment. These are absolute pacifists, that they very often deserve punishment, but we ought not to punish them. We ought not to punish them because their desert provides only a pro tanto reason for punishing them, but there are all things considered reasons not to punish them. And this construal of pacifism, which I think is a more plausible version of pacifism, connects to the issue of proportionality. So you said that pacifists can't make sense of liability or that they ignore or deny proportionality. But once we think of pacifists this way, as believing that there are pro tanto reasons to punish someone, then we can see how they can make sense of retrospective liability as well as proportionality. It just turns out that the reasons not to punish someone have lexical priority when we're doing the proportionality calculation. So they might say that human life has value, and this trumps systematically reasons we have to give people what they deserve. So they can make sense of proportionality, they can make sense of retrospective liability, and they just differ with respect to what values there are with respect to the non-pacifists.
I think that's another way of saying what I was getting at when I was discussing the issues, the matters of humanitarianism, right? But I guess part of what I'm trying to argue is that I want to hear the arguments in favor of that position.
Fair enough, but I think that it might be unfair to say of the pacifists that they can't make sense of retrospective liability, that they're denying proportionality. Rather, they just have different values that tell us what we ought to do, how we ought to do the proportionality calculation. That's a much stronger claim than saying that we just disagree as to what values there are.
If that's true, what you're saying, if it turned out to be true, I'm suspicious of it, and I'll try to say why in a second. If it's true, then it appears that we're headed toward, we've reached a dialectical stalemate, as John Fisher likes to say, and there's really nowhere else to go from that point, it seems, because we've reached some rock bottom presuppositions that are just not going to be resolved.
Well, I think at this point that we do philosophy. We come up with examples. We see
right.
where your
right.
has us diagnose these examples, and we do kind of reflective equilibrium between these principles and the examples.
Sure, but I guess what I'm, not to your other point, what I would want to ask this kind of a pacifist, and I'm thinking in terms of punishment theory. The latest version I've seen of this is David Boonin's book on punishment, where he just doesn't believe in it, and this is a trend nowadays.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm characterizing a specific kind of pacifist.
Yeah, and there are punishment theorists, and I say that in quotes because they don't believe in punishment, and this is a shock to us older people who do punishment theory. I now am old. I know that now because the younger people are writing these different theories.
That we ought never to punish, or that people never deserve punishment. Because again, that's the difference.
The concept of desert for this group of people is untenable. Is itself untenable. So that's not something that they would appeal to. So punishment itself, both as an institution and particular forms of it, are not appropriate.
Okay, so it might be better to focus your discussion on those concepts.
Yes. So when I cite Jan's definition, I'm using it as a foray into this discussion of particular punishment theorists who are rejecting punishment outright for what they term as some form of rehabilitation. And so then, in that kind of a context, it's not that what you're saying is irrelevant. No, it's relevant, because that might be the appeal that they would use to justify their position. And I suppose as a retributivist, not the kind that most of you are thinking of, but retributivism properly construed, counterintuitive is the word that really comes to mind when I think of and one doesn't want to get emotional about this. I use some harsh examples to try home a point, but one doesn't have to do that. Just to simply say, this deserves rehabilitation, and then one has to, what do? Use reflective equilibrium to try to resolve this drastic difference in intuitions about what is proportional.
No, that's all fair enough.
Right.
I just wanted to deny that they can't make sense of liability or retrospective liability and proportionality.
I guess I'm wondering about that.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, and I put my own name here with a short question. But